in Studio One for a session on algorithmic colonialism with Dr. Alex Ketchum and Dr. Rumman Chowdhury. Alex Ketchum is going to introduce the session, and I'll introduce her. She's a professor at McGill University, where she is a professor in the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. She received her PhD in history from McGill University with an MA in Women and Gender Studies and History and a BA in honors, with honors in Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Her work integrates food, environmental, technology, and gender history, and she's the founder of the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technologies Speaker and Workshop Series. Take it away, Alex.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you everyone for coming here today. I especially want to thank MUTEC IMG for collaborating with this speaker series. It's very wordy, so I won't repeat its name over and over again. And this is actually the 6th event that we've done so far of this speaker series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technologies Practices Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, people in industry, working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. Part of the motivation of why this series started this year is because while humanities scholars and social scientists will critique traditional academic publishing and communication strategies as being sexist, classist, racially biased, and inaccessible, the kinds of solutions that are often proffered, such as open access, such as innovative new technologies, often romanticize and fetishize technological alternatives and do not look at how inequity can be perpetuated or only shifted, especially at the level of algorithms. As we seek to draw attention to power relations that have long been invisibilized, it's important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and political practices. We are currently located on unceded territory. I want to thank some of the sponsors of the series, primarily Shirk, who's our largest sponsor, as well as the IGSF, Mila, Element AI, many different organizations at McGill, RICAF, Le Gouillon, and more. I also want to invite you to check out our many events. So all of them, besides this one, are free and open to the public. We also try to stream many of them on our website. We have over 22 events this year, including Meredith Whitaker, who's co-founder of the AI Now Institute, Ruha Benjamin, who's the author of The New Jim Code, Race After Technology, Abigail Ecohawk on decolonializing data, Sarah Myers-West on AI and intersectionality, and in 2 weeks, we're bringing Mimi Onuaha on September 5th and 6th. She's doing an event at Element AI with us and one at McGill, which will be about missing data sets, the kind of data sets that you think would already exist but don't. Again, these are all free to attend. You can find out on our website there, or if that's too wordy, there's a redirect at disruptingdisruptions.com. So now for today's event, which I'm super excited about, and thank you for coming to. Dr. Rumman Chowdhury's passion lies at the intersection of artificial intelligence and humanity. She holds degrees in quantitative social science and has been a practicing data scientist and AI developer since 2013. She is currently the global lead for responsible AI at Accenture Applied Intelligence, where she works with C-suite clients to create cutting-edge technical solutions for ethical, explainable, and transparent AI. In her work as Accenture's responsible AI lead, she led the design of the Fairness Tool, a first-in-industry algorithmic tool to identify and mitigate bias in AI systems. Dr. Chowdhury holds 2 undergraduate degrees from MIT, a master's degree in quantitative methods of the social sciences from Columbia University, and a doctorate in political science from the University of California, San Diego. Today, she'll be speaking about algorithmic colonialism. Thank you for coming, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Chowdhury.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much for being here. So I live in San Francisco, so this to me is very extreme weather. So I was about to thank you all for braving the extreme weather to be here. My talk today is on algorithmic colonialism. But first I want to start a little bit about myself. So as Alex said, I'm a data scientist, a social scientist, oh, that's clever, responsible AI lead at Accenture, I'm an advocate for the responsible use of technology. And most importantly, I'm a child of immigrants. So when I think about the use of algorithms, I don't just think about it from a Western perspective, I think about it from the perspective of the global South as well. My family's from Bangladesh, which is probably most famously known for a Beatles concert to raise funds for it. Other than that, I don't know what we are known for, frankly, than lots of images of poverty, which is quite unfortunate because we are a country with a very, very rich culture, a very rich musical, innovative, artistic background, and interestingly, some very great architecture. So when I think about technology, as I mentioned, I think about the development of the global South, and technological investment is absolutely booming. We have in Kenya what's known as the Silicon Savannah, where there's been massive growth. And actually in Kenya is where the M-Pesa started, which is actually one of the first mobile-to-mobile currencies. And interestingly, in North America, we've been a little behind on that, on picking up the mobile-to-mobile transfer of funds. But it's actually existed for quite some time. We also have a lot of investment by foreign companies. And we have a lot of funds, VC funds, going into the development of startups. And specifically, we're seeing a development of foreign infrastructure. So in Rwanda, we have a UK-based firm making one of the most advanced multi-purpose electronic ID cards. So it's not just ID cards. It's your birth certificate, it's your marriage certificate, it's identification at the border for jobs, et cetera. And that was developed by a UK firm. There's a plan called Belt and Road Initiative in China. So basically, China has announced that they want to be the global leader in AI, and specifically have put a dollar tag on it. They've said they want a $150 billion global industry by 2030. That's purely Chinese. So in order to do so, however, even if they have very advanced artificial intelligence, they're smart to know that it is built, developed, and tailored for a Chinese population. So if you try to expand it beyond their borders, it's actually quite difficult. And specifically, when you think about facial recognition, you may have heard the studies that show that facial recognition does not recognize darker-skinned faces, and particularly faces of darker-skinned women, as readily as it recognizes lighter-skinned men. So in China, their facial recognition is almost entirely trained on Asian faces, and specifically Chinese faces. So how do you diversify? Well, part of it is to invest in Africa. And China's actually been quite aggressive, more so than the US. So they've actually built out the digital infrastructure across Africa. So Transsion Holdings, which is a Shenzhen-based company, is actually the #1 smartphone company in Africa in 2017. ZTE, which is a telco giant, basically builds the infrastructure for the Ethiopian government. That's how they have done it. They go into the government, they talk about digitizing and modernizing the cities, record keeping, et cetera. And then importantly, Cloudwalk is a Chinese company working with the Zimbabwean government to implement everything from CCTV cameras, smart financial systems, security at airport, railways, and buses, and a national facial database. And to understand the depth of the infrastructure development, if we look at the entire continent, how many different countries have their infrastructure built out by Chinese companies? So this is specifically thinking about surveillance projects, but also things like office and network projects. So they've been laying down 5G mobile connections and 4G mobile connections all across the continent in many different countries. That sounds great, right? I mean, investment's good. You know, the ability to have homegrown infrastructure development would be quite difficult. Globalization is very real. Globalization is not necessarily entirely bad. This sounds wonderful, the digitization, the investment, the development, and also the narrative around it, where it's supposed to be enabling local businesses to flourish. You're enabling startup founders to create companies, and definitely there's a massive startup scene happening, specifically in Kenya and Nigeria. So is there a problem here? So my background, as Alex had mentioned earlier and I mentioned, is in political science. And in political economy, there is a term known as the resource curse, or the paradox of plenty. And what the resource curse is nations that actually have had an abundance of natural resource, so oil, minerals, they tend to have less economic growth, poorer democracy, and worse development outcomes. That sounds very paradoxical. You're literally sitting on free money. So what happens? Where does it fall apart? So is resource rich bad? So To give you a definition, a resource-rich country is one that derives at least 20% of exports or 20% of fiscal revenue from some non-renewable natural resource. So again, gas, oil, gas, diamonds, etc. And about half of them, so the IMF has about 51 countries that are classified as resource-rich, and approximately 29 of them are considered to be middle to low income. And what does that mean? That means an extreme dependence on resource wealth. So essentially their economy relies on this non-renewable, therefore finite, natural resource. They also tend to have low savings rates, poor growth performance, lower rates of education, high levels of unemployment, and also highly volatile resource revenue. So if your entire economy is based on one product, one good, and actually you don't produce it, you just pull it out of the ground, you mine it, or you drill for it, then your entire economy is a function of global pricing, right? So if suddenly the oil market plummets for some reason, there goes your economy. So it's highly volatile, which is quite dangerous when we think about the stability of an economy, of a democracy. So what leads to this inconsistency? So why are some countries resource-rich and functioning, and other countries resource-rich and not functioning? So first, the question to ask is, what is the system of government and governance? What is the kind of power structures that exist? Who is in power? Is it privatized? Is it public? How trustworthy are the institutions? And there are a lot of measures about trustworthiness, transparency of institutions. And is there a global systemic infrastructure that incentivizes corruption? This is really important. So one of the critiques I would have of political economy or political science in general is when it looks at a nation, it sort of treats that nation like it lives in a bubble and not a global ecosystem. And this is really critical to understanding why some countries are resource-rich but economically poor, and why others ended up the other way. So keeping those four things in mind, I'm going to give you an example. And one of the examples we use, and it's a term referred to as Dutch disease. And the story behind this is that in 1959, there was a large pool of natural gas discovered in the Netherlands, which sounded fabulous, right? So suddenly natural gas floods the market. There's all this money, but the money is centralized in the hands of a few companies. It is not actually redistributed among people very readily. So what ends up happening, essentially, without boring you with a lot of economic details, is that the sale of this one natural resource drives up the value of the currency. But then none of the other industries can flourish because their product's value is not as high value as this natural gas. So what happens is other industries start to collapse, and everything starts to centralize around natural gas, which is actually not a good thing, because that means your economy is not diverse. And if your economy isn't diverse, as I mentioned, one little shock to one industry can lead to massive unemployment, economic unrest, et cetera. And that's actually what happened. So the currency became inflated. There was a massive amount of unemployment. And what happened was the government had to intervene. So they actually had to privatize jobs, create new jobs in the public sector to combat unemployment, and essentially give out more welfare. And again, back to those four questions, they had a more trustworthy government, and they had the right institutions in place to handle the situation when it arose. So it's a phenomenon we call Dutch disease, and we're going to see this over and over when it comes to resource-rich countries. So let's think about the socioeconomic system. So there's two ways a country can be structured. One is horizontal integration, and that's actually organically how most countries or communities exist. So there's community interdependence. In other words, if you have an agricultural economy, somebody grows wheat, somebody owns a mill, somebody bakes bread. You're all kind of reliant on each other. You have to work together. And these are homegrown. If you have an agricultural economy around raising wheat, well, it's because you have the right kind of climate, the right kind of soil, and the right kind of skill set. And again, by having community interdependence, you have a decentralized and diverse manner of wealth, and that makes people have to actually get along. So you may have to put your political or religious or other differences aside in order to actually have your livelihoods. So what happens with the resource curse is that it starts to push your economy towards a vertical integration. So there's very few or only one source of industry. And what you're exporting is really raw materials. There is no production involved. So as I mentioned with the farming industry, it would be growing a crop, maybe processing it, making something else out of it, selling it, multiple people in the chain. But if you are just drilling for oil, mining for diamonds, et cetera, and that's controlled by one company or one entity, you're not having that diversification of skill sets, and that labor force may not actually come from your own people. That's actually what we see in Saudi Arabia, by the way, where they have a very high percentage of their labor force come from places like Bangladesh, where their workers are highly exploited and treated very, very poorly. And that leads to a centralization of power, and the only way to redistribute wealth in this case is if the government steps in, has high levels of taxation, and forces a redistribution. And that's quite difficult if you don't have, back to those 4 questions, a stable and secure form of government and trustworthy institutions. And finally, just the way it's been built, it's winner takes all. It's zero sum. Either you mine those diamonds or somebody else gets them. There is no renewable resource. It's finite. It's going away. And once, it's sort of human nature, once we have a finite good, we start to fight over it. So I'm going to give you a few case studies. So one is Gabon, right? So this is a characteristic of a Dutch disease phenomenon. So in 1970s, oil's discovered, massive amounts of oil. And until diversification attempts, and even today, there you go, 80% of the revenue of that one country comes from oil. And then in spite of a lot of money going into education, less than 50% of all students graduated secondary school. It also is a country that did not have reliable institutions, so it's patronage politics. So after it was liberated from the French, you had Omar Bongo, who was replaced by his son, and then in 2016, the re-elections were highly controversial, to say the least. Today, about 1/3 of the population lives below the poverty line. There's 20 to 30% youth unemployment. So again, they're sitting on a massive amount of wealth. Where does it go? Who takes it? And why is their government the way it is? Now, Dutch disease would say, well, it's because the natural resource had led to the vertical integration of the economy. They have unreliable government services, and this is why the country is in the current position it's in. There's a lot of papers by the IMF, World Bank, et cetera, that's focused on how do we rebuild, how do we diversify the economy. But wait, there is a rebuttal to the resource curse, because if you were to map the countries that are resource rich but democracy poor, well, there seems to be a pattern. And a quote from Dr. Amy Niang, and if you had a chance to look over the readings, it was the Al Jazeera opinion piece. What she says is the foundations of this model were laid during colonialism, when imperial powers, through conquest and coercion, acquired sovereign prerogatives from levying taxes and imposing customs duties to signing treaties and administering justice. And again, to make a parallel from where I'm from, my country didn't exist until the 70s. In fact, I joke that my father was born in India, raised in Pakistan, and later his country became Bangladesh without ever having moved his house. And that's because of the British. They took an actual functioning society and tore it apart by sowing seeds of unrest based on religion. And a lot of what we see, our liberation and the division in the region has its roots in colonialism. And we see quite a similar thing when it comes to the resource curse. And actually there is actually, when we think about the global systemic incentives for corruption, it actually exists, and we've actually seen an example. So going back to Gabon as my example, there was a massive controversy on something called the ELF system, which was basically when French political parties were using their former colonized countries as a way of secret financing for French political parties and basically having them as slush funds. And also when we think about the wealthier nations in the world and why they are wealthy. So I go to Norway a lot. I haven't in a while, but I really love Norway. I love my Norwegian friends. They're a very warm, kind, and open people. And they love to talk about how their country is going carbon neutral, how everyone's going to own a Tesla, how they don't contribute to climate change. But I love to point out that all of their money was built on oil. And actually what I told somebody once is, well, you're kind of like a drug dealer who doesn't use drugs. And that's essentially what this is. By historical extraction, certain countries are able to be better and leaving others behind. But then when it comes to understanding the systemic reasons why corruption happens, even in the face of massive amounts of natural resources and wealth, conveniently people seem to forget colonization, and how essentially what happens is it's not just about taking over the land, it's about eradicating livelihoods, kinship ties, familial ties and replacing it with colonization. All right, so what does this have to do with technology? Feels like I took a little bit of a left turn. We're talking about technology, then now we're talking about oil and gas. But it's actually really important. So you may have heard the phrase data is the new oil. So in my field, we're sort of tired of talking about that, and there's really great papers on the terminology around AI and data, et cetera. But data is the new oil was, I suppose, the phrase that launched a million analogies, but essentially that data is what drives the economy of technology. It is actually not, sort of the fancy new gadgets you get. None of those would be possible without massive amounts of data being harvested and collected. And even the words we use, data mining, data harvesting, processing, it sounds like farming, it sounds like agriculture. And the punchline is, we're the cows. So this is a quote from Marion Fourcade and Kieran Healy. Modern organizations are now driven by a data imperative that demands the extraction of all data from all sources by any means possible. However, data is not mined, it is extracted. And this is like the punchline. There's one thing you walk away with, it's this. To extract, you need to build and control the infrastructure. So why is it important to build and control the infrastructure? Because actually this data doesn't automatically exist. We don't pull it out of the ground. It has to be collected, has to be measured, has to be stored somewhere. So to collect, measure, and store, you have to own the devices that do that. In other words, be the #1 smartphone provider, be laying out the 5G network, own the cloud compute system where all of this data is stored. Then now you are the one in charge. You're the one controlling the very assets, the very lifeblood that runs all of technology. So let's go through another case study, Perpetual Debt in the Silicon Savannah. So as an aside, this is actually quite interesting. When I read this article, it hit home for me. So this is about the M-Pesa, as I mentioned earlier. And with the M-Pesa, there was a lot of liberation and people able to do things like send money to each other. And companies started to pop up to allow people to take out microloans. Now, the issue was that there was no history of credit scoring in these regions. And so, well, how do you create a credit score? And two companies, Tala and Branch, stepped in and said, we're going to use data science and fancy computational methods to create a credit score. Now, I would like to point out that both of these companies are based in Silicon Valley. So they are not homegrown organizations, not homegrown companies. What they do is you have an app you put on your phone, and it actually mines all the data off your phone. Your texts you send, the people you call, it even looks at your social media. And it does that, and what it does is it combines it into a score. They also do a network analysis to create a level or a measure of trustworthiness or creditworthiness as a function of all this data it's picked up. So interestingly, and so it was hit home to me, I actually interviewed for a head of data science job at Branch in 2016. And one of the reasons I did was the founder of Branch was one of the co-founders of Kiva. If you're familiar with Kiva, they still exist. It's a micro-lending platform, which I used for very many years. You can put in as little as $20, $5, and give out microloans to specific individuals to help them in their livelihood. And actually, the one thing I always found very heartening about Kiva was that I've actually net gained money somehow in my Kiva account because people almost always pay it back. That's kind of the beautiful thing about humanity is that you can give money to a complete stranger, they'll use it to improve their lives, and they'll say, hey, thank you so much. Here's that $5 you gave me 5 years ago. And I thought that was a very beautiful thing, which is actually why I interviewed for the job. So I was actually quite dismayed and horrified. This is before ethics and AI, and we were even talking about these things. But it's like you knew something was wrong when there was something being put on your phone that's so invasive. And how, really, would somebody actually understand what it means if it's tracking your phone calls, your text messages? It seems very personal and invasive. But that's what these companies do. So sitting in Silicon Valley, you put an app on your phone, you're able to get some sort of money, and then you pay it back. So here's the problem with it. So as this quote says, it reveals a novel digitized form of slow violence that operates not so much through negotiated social relations nor the threat of state enforcement as through the accumulation of data, the commodification of reputation, and the instrumentalization of society. And I loved that phrase so much because it really gets at how this is exactly like colonialism all over again. You're abolishing kinship ties here. It's not that Kenyans didn't actually lend, of course they lent each other money before. A friend would borrow from a friend, you'd borrow from your uncle, your parents, they'd say, all right, get your business going, but then pay me back. What that does is establish community ties, it establishes friendships, it establishes reliance on each other. And again, back to this horizontal integration versus vertical integration. What these apps do is it dehumanizes these social transactions that are the lifeblood of our societies. We are supposed to interact with each other. We are supposed to borrow money from each other or forget to pay it back and have to have your parents intervene to make sure. This is what keeps society functioning. And what we do when we eliminate those kinship ties, and also link it to some nameless, faceless organization that is half a world away, whose founders may have never even stepped foot in your village or neighborhood or even your country, what we've done is erased it and then centralized it halfway across the world, and yet again, to the privileged and the wealthy. So they then control the infrastructure, the data. They're also creating assessments and judgments about people they have no links and no ties to. And also, it then eradicates, as I've mentioned, the ties that bind us together as a society. Case study 2 is Zimbabwean Cloudwalk. So as I mentioned earlier, Cloudwalk has agreed with the Zimbabwean government to institute what they call Safe Cities Initiative. So this is sort of the selling point for governments. What these companies go in and say is, we will help you establish safe cities. If there's a crime, we can catch a criminal. If there's terrorism, etc. But of course, if you are familiar at all with Zimbabwean politics, it is not exactly a reliable or highly democratic society. So the fear is that the Zimbabwean government will use this excuse to, quote, preserve law and order as a guise to monitor and restrict citizens' and online behaviors. And actually, Cloudwalk is actually the first institution of true artificial intelligence in Africa by a Chinese company. And there's a lot of fear here, and it's actually justified. So Mugabe had actually had a deal with the Iranian government to have drones doing monitoring in his nation. He's actually also expressed that the way China controls social media is what his aspiration was for his country. So there has been an actual expression, a desire to want to use these technologies to monitor and control people. So again, the entire infrastructure will be controlled by a foreign entity. Oh, and here's the kicker to it. Without consent, part of the deal is to provide millions of black faces to the Chinese company to train its models. So back to the data as lifeblood of technology, all of these people, just by walking out on the street, are participating in the extraction, mining, and selling of a natural resource, and they have no ownership of it. They have no ownership of their own faces when they go outside to go to the market. This data is monitored, captured, and sold to a foreign entity, which will then use it to improve its power, its economic power in the world. Then case study 3, Uganda, Zambia, and Huawei. And this was the video as well as the Wall Street Journal article that I sent Nina. And I think I had mentioned if there's anything you read or watch, have it be that. So Huawei engineers have actually worked directly with Ugandan government to, this is the person in this picture is Bobby Wine. He is a viable opposition candidate, backed and supported by more free democratic nations, and actually with wide support from the people. But actually, Huawei engineers work directly with the government to hack into his private accounts, his Facebook account, his WhatsApp group, etc. And it's actually technically legal under a 2010 law, which gives the government the ability to, quote, secure its multidimensional interests. So keeping it broad enough that you can use it to hack your opposition's social media. And again, if they hadn't laid out the infrastructure were able to, actually what they do is they installed malware into his phone. So what he does, he actually has a separate phone now. And again, if you watch the video, it's fascinating, it's scary, the extent to which people need to be taking security measures to protect themselves. In Zambia, Huawei technicians helped the government access the phones and Facebook pages of opposition bloggers, who were then later arrested. Huawei as an organization has actually denied all of these things, but the journal says they have specific names, transcripts, et cetera, associated with it. So again, governments are now using this infrastructure and partnering with these companies in order to perpetuate their repressive regimes. So this is more than a surveillance ecosystem, right? This is more than facial recognition. This is a surveillance ecosystem. There's a lot of focus on facial recognition, and that's necessary but insufficient. So what does it mean? What is a surveillance ecosystem? So first of all, it's characterized by privatized or foreign actors controlling the civic digital backbone. And this is where my argument or my discussion expands beyond just the global south to look around our cities today. And what happens when you have a company or a private interest controlling and essentially able to hold for ransom your civic digital infrastructures, you have, in poli-sci, what we would call political and economic and regulatory capture. So how would you regulate against a company if you know that it processes and holds all the birth certificates of everybody who lives in your city, or all of their driver's license information, all the stuff you need to keep a functioning society? So it means that you are now infrastructurally reliant on a private actor for things like cloud-based data systems, facial recognition, online monitoring tools, financial software, and importantly, government services. So these are things like citizenship records, birth records, and passports. And importantly, digitizing creates data, and that sounds obvious, but I'll give you a really great example from the city of San Francisco. One really great innovative thing they had installed was police cars would be able to use license plate scanners. So instead of manually tracking cars to see if they were illegally parked for too long, the license plate scanner would automatically pick it up. So what that ends up happening is creating a database of license plates and timestamps. So now this data exists. So now if you own a car in San Francisco and you park it in a public place, there's essentially a record of where you have been. And you were not giving consent to this data simply by being outside. It's being collected about you. So although San Francisco is a sanctuary city, now this data exists, the Border Patrol and ICE have actually requested this data set in order to track people. And this is the way in which digitizing creates data. This infrastructure reliance on private parties can be dangerous because those actors are not incentivized to work in the public best interest. So what can we do? So here are a few things that we learned from the resource curse literature. Number one, good governance. Number two, creating horizontal economies. So again, community kinship ties, reliance on each other, and maybe even homegrown industry and community-controlled industry. Decentralized power. And most importantly, competition and diversification, because the one thing that happens, and this is actually one of the paradoxes of artificial intelligence and all these technologies, they tend to try to centralize upwards. So when we create an algorithm, as a data scientist, we have a goal of generalizability. And generalizability means, how can my model be used in as many situations as possible? So if I'm creating a model about credit scoring, I don't want to just make it for one specific audience. I want it to be able to be used widely, which makes sense from a business perspective. But from a community perspective, an individual's perspective, it flattens you. We have no diversity, and it does not respect the multidimensionality of societies, structures, and the context in which these algorithms are applied. But what happens with generalizability, essentially we start to push all the power upwards and into more centralized locations and nodes. So one way to combat is to have competition and diversification. And how can we prevent the rise of surveillance states? So it's not just these few case studies. I realize I focused very much on the African continent, but the same thing is actually happening over and over again in India, and it's actually being used to exclude religious minorities, specifically the Assamese. And it's also being used between Myanmar and Bangladesh to delegitimize the Rohingya. So essentially when the Rohingya escaped genocide and came over into Bangladesh, they were not given digital identities. And some of them tried to pass as Bangladeshi. And now that they're creating digital identities, as human beings, they do not exist. They're not Bangladeshi, and Myanmar does not recognize them either. So, what else should we think about to prevent the rise of surveillance states? We've had the facial recognition ban starting in the US, which is great, necessary, but insufficient. We have to think about the entire ecosystem and specifically create safeguards for our civic digital infrastructure of our cities and countries. So my last case study is a positive one. Seattle in 2017 passed a surveillance ordinance, and how they define surveillance technologies are ones that observe or analyze the movements, behavior, or actions of identifiable individuals in a manner that is reasonably likely to raise concerns about civil liberties, freedom of speech or association, racial equity, or social justice. So it's really wonderful here that they have enumerated the harms. And here's where we move beyond maybe a more quantitative perspective on what it means to have a good or a just or a functioning system into a more qualitative human approach, where it's actually about impact. And I won't read the whole thing, but essentially the surveillance ordinance means that you have to have regular reports and impact assessments on how this technology is used or possibly misused in society. It is not, however, without flaws. Police body cams do not count as part of the surveillance technology, and what they would call is general office use technologies do not count either. One of the first places, by the way, we will see this sort of mass surveillance will be in what I call limited rights environments. So children in schools, prisoners, and office workers, because we don't have any rights to our information, our data, et cetera, when we are in our workplace. We don't have rights to our email, our calendar, even our laptops, our computers. We all implicitly know this, but we still act very personally, and we reveal a lot of information. So things like office use is actually a way in which we will be surveilled, unfortunately, is not covered under the ordinance. However, the ordinance is an amazing place to start. It decentralizes power, it gives community access and control, it creates transparency around the systems, and it allows for regulation. So just to wrap up, a bit of conclusion. So first, technological development of the global south is potentially beneficial, but should not be blindly adopted. And we've learned these lessons from the resource curse, in which there's so much potential wealth to be had, but it was extracted and it was used, and these people were exploited, and their kinship ties completely eradicated. And what we don't want to do is replicate that. What we want to do is prevent a recolonization of the global south in citizen empowerment, good governance, and horizontal systems of power. Thank you.
Thank you, Rumman, for that talk. I'm just going to start us off with the first question, and then we'll have mics going around for other questions. So I want to thank you first for discussing the history of extraction and colonialism. And I'm going to ask a pretty broad question that you can approach as you wish. It's just to try to get like the juices flowing for the conversation to follow with the audience. In our age of neocolonialism, what would models of non-extractive and non-exploitative AI and data collection look like, especially beyond the kind of municipal level that you showed with Seattle?
Right, so obviously good governance is one way to start, but I think there's a lot of community work that can happen. There are some groups that are working on things like community interventions, workshops about data ownership. There's a really great group called a project called Our Data Bodies, which is about educating. And really the first step is always education. People need to understand what this information is and how it can be used or misused. The reason why I talk about a surveillance ecosystem rather than a technology, because in a bubble and in and of itself, it's hard to see how this is invasive. If I were to try to say, well, you know, don't buy a smart doorbell because it's taking pictures, people would say, why? It sounds safer. But if I then explain the ecosystem where this information is sold to the police and the police use it to monitor neighborhoods, it starts to become more obvious why these things are bad. So there's a lot of community engagement that starts with education.
Thank you. Questions from the audience?
Do you think that maybe, like in terms of decentralization, do you think there's maybe like a need for government to be building technology infrastructure? Because it seems like private is like outpacing government, and maybe, I mean, government's not always the most responsible entity, but maybe they need to catch up. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think you're touching on really the problem here is, well, people don't want to trust private companies. We also don't always trust the government to do the right thing. How can we create a good system? What I will say, though, the government is accountable to its citizens in a way that private companies are not. So this is not to say governments are all good or will always do the right thing. It's actually more that we have more of a system of accountability. So all of the stories you hear about whatever big tech company doing whatever they do, is not actually information that we had if it weren't for whistleblowers or people speaking up, or somehow that information getting leaked. They don't owe us anything, and they're also not incentivized to help us. I think also thinking about decentralization from a technological perspective, and I'm gonna get a little bit tech nerdy here, the rise of 5G and edge computing actually has the ability to create decentralized algorithmic processing and data storage, which will actually help, which can, if structured properly, actually help us here. So right now, if you were to collect all this data, it goes to like one big location in the cloud and it gets processed and sent back. Decentralization will lead to different hubs everywhere processing and storing that data. Why is that important? Because theoretically it could link to your smartphone. And again, this is imaginary infrastructure, doesn't exist yet. But it could theoretically link to your smartphone and you can have controls to say, I don't want my face scanned, et cetera. And that could travel with you. So it's not that it would have to be passed at a city level. Theoretically, if it were structured the right way, you could just control it on your phone, and wherever you went, the systems would adjust to you. That would be a really amazing way to see these technologies evolve so that you can have a functioning smart city that's not a surveillance state.
Hi, thank you so much.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, sorry. I too get frustrated with the data as oil metaphor, although my particular annoyance with it is that you don't really need to go very far from a computer to get to those metaphors, because they're literally made out of rocks and oil, right? And the question I have, having spent some time trying to connect these kinds of threads more closely together, is kind of how deep, as people interested in trying to find more like spaces for like just or, you know, responsible technologies, how deep down the supply chain are we really ready to go? Because I find often when I start to bring this stuff up, there's a feeling of like, it's too big, it's too much, and like that's someone else's problem, or that's like a different set of problems. And I'm not sure really whether or not I'm just chasing like the wrong agenda, or there's like something there.
Yeah, and if I were to maybe sort of paraphrase your fear, it's something that a lot of us in the tech ethics space share. It's that there are these massive problems that, and when you, as you mentioned, you dig deeper, it's actually, it's not about, it can be about bad data leading to racist algorithms. It can also lead to the exploitation of workers being used to tag data, or what about content moderation, or what about this or that. And what I would say is the beautiful thing about the tech ethics space is we are a cohesive community. We're essentially an activist community, and hopefully you'll be able to attend some of the other talks that are being held by Alex and her group, because the other folks that are coming are all wildly different. And they may focus on something like critical race studies, or protecting whistleblowers, or helping people unionize, or debiasing algorithms, or whatever they do. We're all playing a role, and we're all serving a part in the ecosystem. So my statement would be that no one person or one group, just like with any activist group, no one person or one group can solve this problem. It has so many levels. But the good thing is there are a lot of people very actively trying to fix these things.
Great talk, thank you. I have a question as well. So I have one foot in Toronto, and I've kind of been watching with moderate revulsion as Sidewalk Labs has rolled out their consultation, with air quotes, process around the Portland's development. So I was just wondering if you could comment on the scope of that plan and the way that it's been communicated to the public, because I think that really fits in nicely with a lot of what you talked about.
Yeah, so actually after, I think on Friday, I'm heading to Toronto, and Saturday I'm giving a talk, this talk again in Toronto. Actually I'm meeting up with Bianca Wiley, who has been a major player in the movement to inform people, to push back, et cetera, against Sidewalk Labs. So I can't say I know as much as a lot of other folks there do, but I suppose if there's people in the audience who don't know what we're talking about, Sidewalk Labs is a private company that has been creating a, quote, digitized waterfront in Quayside in Toronto, and it has been plagued since day one with a lot of issues ranging from privacy. I think there was a very dramatic moment where their privacy officer stepped down and wrote this whole letter about why she was stepping down and how problematic it was. But really it's been about, and Bianca and folks like Bianca have been trying to create systems of accountability and transparency. And actually what I really like about Bianca's work is, she's not, and again, I don't want to misrepresent her work, but she's not trying to say there should be no digitization. What she's saying is we have to empower people the right way. And what she's been trying to do is engage in a dialogue and sort of a public process that's more meaningful and not just sort of ethics washing or having a checklist. Other than that, I can't say I know enough. I will also say, though, that Sidewalk has been working with City of Portland to track cell phone data, and presumably what they're trying to do for the city is figure out traffic flows to optimize city development of transit, et cetera. But actually what it does is, every time your cell phone pings a tower, it's picking up that information. So it has basically ghost personas of every person in Portland, and it tracks their movements, even though they say it's completely anonymous and they don't know who people are, et cetera. But all of that is always highly fungible and questionable, because as I said, once you've collected data, you have data. But yeah, it's a really great point. I know I focused a lot on the global south, but these are technologies that are being implemented and instituted today in our cities and our neighborhoods.
Hi, I have a.
There, oh, okay.
I guess I have a question about the incentives that tech companies have, and like how maybe there's like a much larger problem of like angel investment, this sort of like move fast and break things issue, and the other part of that is how do you see the education of the public in relationship to like, for instance, climate change and the difficulties that have been there?
Yeah, it's a really great point. So interestingly, and I would have never seen this coming, there's this intersection happening between what we talk about in technology and actually climate change. It will take an increasing amount of compute power to process the amount of data that's generated. It's not just the data itself, it has to go through an algorithm, has to be processed, et cetera. And that requires, carbon use. And actually there is a good amount of carbon generated from training more sophisticated algorithms. So it is increasing this intersection, this concern on how all of these technologies relate to climate change. So that is an excellent point. I just completely forgot the first part of your question, though, because you had made the excellent point about the link to climate change. Can you remind me the first part? Oh, sorry, Mike ran away.
I guess I was thinking about like the impetus for tech companies to like ignore regulations and things like that.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, and you raise such a great point. So I talk a lot about incentives as well. If you're all familiar with poli-sci or social sciences, like a lot of it's driven on like utility functions, et cetera, sort of taught to us by the economist gods. And it's oversimplified, but it's helpful to think about things in terms of actors and incentives. So what are the incentives in the tech industry? One of the problems is the entire economy is built on the consumption of data. So Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, it's massive. It's like this thick. But even if you just read the first few chapters, you get a really good perspective on the industry that is built around data. And she makes this really interesting point where the kind of data that's used isn't the data we think that is used, like our names or whatever. It's actually largely what's known as data exhaust. So what websites you clicked on, how long you hovered over an image, that's actually the kind of stuff that's often monitored about you. And like I said, your GPS location, which sounds like silly, but you can decipher so much of it. So it's difficult. So regulation, we think about regulation, and again, oversimplification. You regulate basically land, labor, and capital. And these tech companies don't really need any of that. You don't need land, because everything is, unless it's like server farms, and like which you could have anywhere, so you can buy the cheapest land possible in the middle of a desert in Arizona. You have to spend a lot of money on cooling, but fine. Labor, well, actually these tech companies employ far fewer people than you'd imagine. Facebook, I think, has about fewer than 100,000 employees, given how much power, global power an organization has to have so few people working there. And capital, again, you can have a completely decentralized workforce. They don't need offices. So what do you regulate? And these companies make so much money, giving a fine is sometimes almost laughable. And one of the critiques of HUD's $5 billion fine to Facebook was that they're just going to pay it and move on. So we do need to make more meaningful regulation to create those incentives. But fundamentally, really and there's a lot of bills on the table, the Algorithmic Accountability Bill, the Deepfakes Act, the Detour Act. The fundamental problem here, though, especially with thinking about things like dark patterns, et cetera, we're actually telling these companies to do the thing that's contrary to their business model. What you and I may call manipulation would be what another company calls user engagement. And these are the metrics they are judged by. So like, one thing we have not addressed, and we really just need to tackle this issue, is are we okay, we as sort of a government entity, et cetera, okay with saying company X, you actually need to act not in your own best interest. And I think everyone's been dancing around this issue, but there is no fundamental addressing of the economic structure that is fundamentally exploitative. Yeah.
Now is it? Okay, sorry. So you do so much work in public engagement and education, and you talk a lot about how solutions are based in education. But for a lot of the general populace, tech is moving at such a fast rate. Kind of where do you see a good starting ground for education? What does that kind of look like in your mind?
So one thing I think is really wonderful in the last, I would even say like year or so, there's been a massive explosion in the civic space. So organizations like the ACLU, for example, are very involved now in raising citizen awareness. Actually, it's the ACLU that drove a lot of the facial recognition bans. So it's not like people have to go be tech experts or create a new company or a new nonprofit. It's actually what we are protecting are basic human rights and civil rights. And when we think about it framed that way, there are plenty of organizations that have been doing so for so long and have been engaging with communities. And what's happening now is the communities that have traditionally been working on civil rights and human rights are combining with technologists, and we're sort of merging our skills and abilities to be able to provide that level of education. But the great thing is the infrastructure for distributing this information already exists.
Do you think we need to start to reconsider, reimagine the idea of the historical model of the North exploiting the South? Because it seems nowadays like everybody's just exploiting everywhere. The North is being exploited as well, and I'm just wondering if there's
I don't know if
that
we've been
changes.
exploited to the extent that we have historically exploited other
Of course
nations.
not, but there's.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So if we were to look at, let's say, the U.S., it's unfair to say the U.S. has exploited X because there are communities within the United States have absolutely been exploited. And actually, to take the macro level conversation about algorithmic colonialism and apply it to a Western country, unsurprisingly, the first places we are seeing these surveillance technologies are New Orleans, Detroit. So we are doing the same things to ourselves internally, which is where I think you're kind of going with this. So the first communities we've decided to use these technologies against are low-income housing units, which actually there's a bill against using facial recognition in low-income housing units, thank goodness. But yeah, predictive policing being used in New Orleans, Detroit, et cetera, smart doorbells, information being sold to the police or given to the police, and the police actually being encouraged to tell citizens to buy smart doorbells. So I agree. There is this ecosystem being built of exploitation that's not just at a global level, but it's at a national level as well. We're just replicating these traditional systems of exploitation.
I'm being told we're out of time, but maybe afterwards people can continue this conversation. I want to thank you all again for coming, and thank you to Rumman.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex and Rumman, for this amazing session. That concludes the morning sessions here in this room. We're now taking a 1-hour lunch break. We'll be back here at 1 p.m. For the afternoon sessions, which will continue the conversations around artificial intelligence, looking at authorship and the artistic perspective. So hope to see you back here. Also check the schedule to see what is happening in the Orangery. Thanks, and see you at 1.